Welcome, everybody, to another Rooted Intentionally podcast. I'm Susan Carson, and in these times, we just share a casual conversation with friends and spiritual practices designed to help us all live more deeply rooted in the love of God that heals and restores our souls. And today, I have a new friend with us, Jonathan Puddle. Jonathan, I am so excited that you're here with us.
I'm excited to be here. I'm so excited. We've already just had a couple of minutes connecting, and my spirit is super pumped.
Yes. Yes, I was well, let me introduce you to folks and then I'll maybe share a little bit about how we first met. But Jonathan is an award-winning writer and speaker, author of this amazing book that I want you, as soon as you listen to this, I want you to go to Amazon and I want you to order this book, this 30-day guided inner healing journey, which can't even, Jonathan, that you thought to do this way. I love more than I can say. You're a pastor and husband, father to three, and you have this amazing podcast called the Puddcast, which I also love. You have some amazing guests. And so, what else do you want people to know about you today? What haven't I mentioned that people should know about you?
I may or may not have tried to pursue a secondary career in dance music DJing at one point. I do occasionally DJ weddings.
Really?
I like red wine and dark beer, and
Mm.
I bake sourdough bread like everybody else during lockdown.
That is what we do here. Yeah. That's awesome.
Born and raised
Awesome.
in New Zealand, I feel like that is people will quickly be like, he sounds different, but I can't put my finger on it.
Yeah.
So yes, born and raised in New Zealand, and then I moved to Toronto when I was 13. So my accent is blended
There
today.
you go. And so we're even international today,
That's
which
right.
is super exciting. You and I met. We are both in the same course through the Open Table Conference on the Book of John, which is like blowing my mind every week. And I posted a question. People were talking about inner healing, and I posted this question like, all right, where are the inner healing people here? And you're like, hello, me. And that's how we met. So I was so excited to find another kindred spirit in that space.
Likewise, because
Yeah.
Brad Jersak does a lot of
Mhm.
work in inner healing, and it's one of the things that I love that he brings to that group. And Brad, uh, his kind of journey and upbringing is very similar to where I've been in the last 10, 15 years in terms of the charismatic church and the inner healing movement. And so I've been so thankful for him and his work and the things he marries together. And so I think there'd been some discussion about inner healing that week, and then you jumped onto that topically, and I was like, yes, another friend.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. I love the way that Brad talks about this. And we all have similar sort of, mine was vineyard, charismatic, inner healing. Yeah. That's the journey. So I
Yeah, I
hear.
was catch the fire. So let's go vineyard, and then let's go 5 steps too far.
Oh gosh, we could probably have a long conversation about what you mean by that. Yes. So I want to keep talking about this. I want to stop for a second though and ask. I have a question that I always ask guests on these Zoomcasts, and it is, what in these crazy days that we are living in now, what's helping you stay rooted?
It's a great question, and I love even just the whole intentional rootedness of what you're doing here, because
Mm,
it's the biggest difference. But
mhm.
like, you can have knowledge and you can have all these things, but to allow something to go deep into your roots is totally life changing. A couple things. the practice that I developed for my own life that resulted in the book I wrote, that's been a lifesaver for me. Being able to tune into my emotions, to the logic parts of my brain as well, and tune into the presence of God, and just be able to move towards myself in gentleness and compassion. To remind myself, like, this is hard. This is a hard situation, a hard season. And hard things are hard. So it's okay to not be thriving. It's okay to just be hanging on. It's okay to talk about surviving without feeling like, oh, I should be doing more than just surviving because I read a Joel Osteen book and I'm supposed to,
Yes.
And so my own practice of being present to God and myself has been a lifesaver. That's not tooting my own horn. That's praising the Spirit for like saving me before I needed saving, as he so often does.
Yes.
Going for walks. Some days it's a 3-day walk, it's a 3-walk day. I mean, I'm like, yes, today one walk is not going to cut it. And the other thing is that I've really, in the last 3 or 4 months, realized I need to prioritize my own fun. I need to do things that are just enjoyable for me. Partly it's because I'm so wired to help. I am an Enneagram 2, and I never think to ask for help, and I'm always sort of trying to be valuable in everybody else's life. And it's been a really hard thing, actually, for me. That's not indulgent fun. That's been really costly and painful for me to be like, Jonathan, you are going to burn out and not going to be able to be helpful unless you stop and do something fun. And so I've been reading historical fiction. I'm currently reading, I don't know if you ever read The Pillars of the Earth, Ken Follett. I'm currently reading World Without End, the sequel to that. So it's sort of 14th century English historical fiction. And I also am currently working my way through Star Trek Discovery. So
awesome.
The future and the past helps me somehow be present in the moment.
I love all of that. And I'm married to a 2. So I understand intimately the dilemma of the 2 that you're describing. And so, yeah, that fun, that almost discipline of fun, super important. Well, I wanted to chat a bit, maybe just about your own journey. You talk, as I do. Actually, I'm just going to read this sentence off the back of your book. Drawing from scripture, trauma-informed therapy, Christian inner healing, breathing and embodiment exercises, and silent prayer and contemplative spirituality, You Are Enough is a holistic healing journey towards abundant life. And when I read that, I thought, you just said beautifully in one sentence everything that we do here through Roots and Branches as a ministry. And you bring this understanding, right, that how we experience God and what we believe about God, what we know to be true and have not just know, right, but experience as true about God, so forms how we view and love ourselves, and that is in essence what our healing journey is. So I would love to hear more about how this sort of all came to fruition or is coming to fruition in your life and in your journey.
Yeah. Thanks. It's the best. That's my favorite story to tell. And yeah, I can tell you also that I put a lot of work into that sentence, trying to boil it down to all the right things, and with my marketing hat on too, to be like, okay, what is actually helpful? Like, what will people actually go, oh, that's what it is.
Yes.
So
yeah, well done.
Well, I mean, I grew up in a really loving, wonderful, grace-filled household. And I think that I can't underestimate how formative that was to have 2 parents at home who were safe. I'm in therapy right now, and we keep coming around these fascinating things that that my home life was so safe that it shielded me from all these other things, and where the world was painful and where teachers and leaders and the scary people were out there, but they weren't in here. And so I have to give so much credit to my parents, who, you know, were broadly evangelical, moving charismatic, and I think that their instincts were even better than the language and the understanding that they had, that they had a real lived value for love and grace. And of course, they're human and imperfect like all the rest of us. But when I look back, that seems to be a really huge piece, that I actually just grew up with this understanding that I was loved and celebrated and cherished. And in addition to that, my parents were actors and dancers. And so there was a creative embodiment aspect to our life that was normal. In fact, we were missionaries. My parents were missionaries with YWAM and in the performing arts division. And so up till my age of 7 or 8, we were traveling all around the South Pacific and around Europe. I'd lived in 4 countries by the time I was at 7, and doing drama productions and street evangelism and all kinds of stuff. Ironically, things that today, both me and my parents are like, yeah, we wouldn't approach it the same way today. My father has gone on much of the same deconstruction journey that people like you and I have gone on. And, so he's able to go, oh yeah, I mean, our hearts were really in a good place, but we have grace for ourselves and for the generations. But in my teens, I moved to Toronto to join the revival. My parents had visited Toronto, had experienced the outpouring, the Toronto blessing. The Toronto church had been a vineyard, and then things they were just like, we're not too sure about this. And so there was a disfellowshipping there. And my parents basically felt quite clearly that God had said, come to Toronto and join this thing. And so I was 13 years old, left my first crush in New Zealand and moved to Canada. And it was a very heartbreaking, devastating experience. But I arrived in a culture that valued inner healing, that was huge on a few things. God is best understood as a loving father. God is real and experienceable right now today. If God is a loving father, and if God is experienceable today, there is healing for your heart. And so that was really timely. And I guess for all teenage boys, but it was great for me. And I grew up in that church, in that environment, and eventually joined the staff after I graduated high school. I didn't have any career prospects lined up. And so I ended up spending like 14 years working at the church and doing all different church things and administrative stuff and business and marketing and all these different things while journeying through all these different things myself spiritually, and coming to a point where I'm like, well, actually, in the midst of all this good spirit-filled stuff, there's also like weird escapist, we could say Gnostic kind of dualism, where it's kind of like let's just heal all the things. Let's not talk about our emotions. Let's not talk about our soul. It's all just about the spirit. And one day we'll be in fluffy white clouds forever. And so, the things that I'm like, this doesn't compute actually. And I'd also gotten really busy in the machinery of church life, and I was getting burned out on it. And I remember my wife and I had just gotten married. I was 19, and I was already going like, yeah, I've got issues with stuff. So we moved abroad for my wife to do a master's, actually in Finland, and we quit church, and we're like, okay, God, show us what's up. And we spent 10 years outside the institutional church, falling back in love with Jesus, and having so much of the religiosity stripped out of our belief system, and just recentering on Christ, the visible image of the invisible God, who lifts people out of the mud who heals people from their shame. I
Yes.
was on a podcast just the other week, and this guy said to me, one wonderful interview, Jason on the Messy Spirituality podcast, he said to me, Jonathan, a lot of people who go through deconstruction don't know what to do with Jesus, because for many, he was indistinguishable from the church, or he was like the CEO of the church. And they had to do difficult, painful work to disentangle themselves from problems in what the church has become. And they don't know what to do with Jesus when it's all said and done. How did you get through that? And I'm just like, man, read the Gospel of John and go through these stories of this guy who is on the bleeding, literally bleeding edge, pushing back against sexism, racism, classism to his own death for our sake. Oh, it just boggles my mind. So
Yes.
when somebody taught me about the centrality of and supremacy of Christ, I was just like, oh. So I ended up back in Canada, and surprisingly back in church, and we're kids pastors, my wife and I, and began writing and podcasting and continuing just journaling with all these things, and letting them kind of coalesce in my heart and my mind. And one of the two big pieces, I guess, that came into it was an inner healing modality called HeartSync, which was it has a lot of, if you know internal family systems, IFS, it has a lot of very, very similar precepts. It developed along a separate path, but today they actually recommend the IFS training for anyone who's looking to become a HeartSync counselor. And so that it was a method of healing so different from anything I'd ever encountered before, so rooted in affirmation, so rooted in every part of you is doing the best it can, and there is no room for shame in your healing journey. And I'd tried all kinds of different modalities, many with good effect, but many that were quite cerebral and left-brained. And I mean, if you know Restoring the Foundations, RTF is a very popular inner healing tool, literally developed by a rocket scientist.
Wow.
And so, you know, some of these tools are very cerebral, and even in the therapeutic like therapy community, you know, we have tools like CBT and other cognitive tools that are very helpful, except when they're not.
Right.
And so learning more about my inner world, my emotional landscape, was a huge piece. And then I had this incredible woman, therapist, author, mother on my podcast named Ondi Kolber. And I could say Ondi if I'm trying to make my accent more translatable. Ondi Kolber. And she began to explain to me what trauma does in the brain and in the body, and how we leave a window of tolerance and begin to act in survival and fight or flight and freeze and fawn and all these different things. And it all began to click for me in new ways. And then I began reading all those other books, and her book, Try Softer, which is an incredible book. She ended up writing the foreword for my book. So that was just a wonderful gift. And so it all began to kind of coalesce. And actually, I was thinking about this when you introduced the show, because your deeply rooted thing, man, I had this guy on my show again who said to me, Jonathan, what if you spent a whole year just celebrating how wonderful you are and enjoying your goodness and loving yourself? What if you spent a whole year practicing loving yourself and you let it go deep into the root system of your being? What would happen? And I remember just being like, oh yeah, well, it's a great question, man. And I just kind of moved on. Something stuck. Some piece of Velcro got attached big time. Wow. And it wasn't long later that I really felt the Lord say, Jonathan, it's time that you learned how to love yourself. It's time you became responsible for owning your own love.
Wow.
And so I went on this kind of therapeutic, spirit-led, wacky journey, laying on my couch and just figuring this all out with my heart and with God. And by the time 60, 90 days had gone by, I was in a totally different space, a totally different person. And I thought to myself, I wonder if I could write this down in like a chunk by chunk kind of way. I have no idea if that's possible. I have no idea if I have the chops to do it. I don't know if I don't know if it's possible to get the benefits of these things without doing a deep dive into each of them yourself. So it was all a crazy experiment. And when the first test readers came back and they said, Jonathan, this is incredible, I was like, oh, good, because I had no idea it would work. So for me, that's kind of how we ended up here. And it's just all a wonderful gift of grace and love as far as I'm concerned. And the more I learn about the Father, the more I learn about myself, the more I learn about love, the more I feel like I've barely scratched the surface.
Yeah, it's there's always more, right? It's ever unfolding and ever emerging, and the goodness of it just keeps getting better and better. I'm finding. Um, and one of the things, and you do this in the book in these chunks that you break up for us, and it seems like it was true in your experiences. You bring us these guided meditations and spiritual practices, right? And I'm finding and learning, we're always still learning how spiritual practices have incredible power to open space for us for healing. And I know you're going to lead us through a practice in a minute, but I would love to hear you just talk to that for a few minutes, spiritual practices and meditation, and how that all sort of coalesces in our healing journeys.
I don't know that I have a really succinct answer to that, but I remember, I'll tell you a funny story.
Yeah.
When I was 12 years old, I first read about Sadhu Sundar Singh. Have you ever read about Sundar Singh? He was this Christian mystic in India, I guess in the early 1900s. And so he had these crazy experiences and these mystical spiritual encounters with God, and plenty of people think he's totally out to lunch. And I've never read the book since. I don't know. Maybe I'll say that name and other people will be like, oh man, we totally canceled that guy. I'm like, I have no idea. Either way, here's what happened. He talked about meditating on God. And I had no grid for what that meant. And so if you had walked up to my bedroom on the right day, you would have found 12-year-old me sitting in the lotus position on my bed with my hands like this, knowing no better than meditating. And I sat there and I went, God is good. God is great. And I literally sat there for about 10 minutes doing this. And this was the full perspective of what I could possibly understand at that age of what meditating meant.
Yeah.
And I don't know how many people I've ever told that story to. I've certainly never acted it out. So,
well, we're honored.
wow, I just did that. So, I got very evangelical, and so all that stuff was evil New Age nonsense. And so it wasn't until probably in the last 5 or 10 years that I had a mentor who, get this, is a Messianic Jewish charismatic Catholic. And
wow.
He's actually a deacon in the Catholic Church. And
Oh.
and he met with me. He's a longtime family friend, and he met with me through some really difficult times in my life and some burnout and a bunch of things. And he said, oh, Jonathan, man, you just really sound like you would benefit from reading St. John of the Cross. And so he introduced me to Dark Night of the Soul, to the Ascent of Mount Carmel. He said, you need to go to Rochester. There's this abbey that you can go to there and have a silent retreat. And so I went and hung out with the Trappist monks, and
love it.
And I began to be quite impacted by the idea that suffering maybe was a part of life, that maybe being present to these things, that there's a refining process, which is not in the sense of kind of like the old evangelical certainty that, well, soon I will be refined enough and then I'll get all my badges and everything is great. But that actually there's like this ongoing journey of God seeking to draw us ever closer to himself. And sometimes that feels like we're being drawn into the burning bush, and maybe that's going to be painful, but maybe that's also good. And so I began to have a bit more of a grid for practices. I started turning up at the Catholic Church now and again, just because it was so different. And I was like,
Yeah.
you guys have just a totally different outlook. And so I began to marry some of the liturgical, sacramental stuff into the rest of my broader faith, and started heard about Brad Jersek's journey into the Orthodox Church. A friend of mine said, "Oh, let's go and do Pascha." And so I went and we did 2 nights of Pascha at an Orthodox church in Toronto, and that was mind blowing, utterly mind blowing, multi-sensory, like interactive community theater.
Wow.
And so all of that began to be like helping, kind of reminding me of my childhood and my parents and acting and all that kind of stuff, and the importance of body, the importance of the senses. I mentioned actually that, that I was a DJ. Years ago, I was involved 2 years at an event put on by an organization who put on clubbing nights for the hearing impaired. And so they would cater like a 5 senses extravaganza, so that folks with hearing impairment or other kinds of sensory impairments could have a night out like no other.
I love that.
That was very impactful to be a part of that and observe that. So then, the Catholic stuff, the liturgical stuff, the sacramental stuff is being married in. And, I've been reading Henry Nouwen and starting to get more into more of the kind of the mystic contemplative stuff. And I was seeing that there was such a connection between the contemplative and the Holy Spirit, and
yes,
kind of just resting or soaking, as some people call it, and that meditation and soaking are very, very similar. And then as I began to get into the therapeutic understanding, it's mindfulness, and I'm like, these are all the same. They're not. I mean, they're different. There's differences. There is nuances, shall we say?
Sure.
But I was like, oh my sweet goodness, God cares about my body. God has one. God took one with him when he returned to his Father. And there are ways that I can learn to be present to my body. I'd already been doing Brother Lawrence stuff, practicing the present, like all these bits and pieces, all were just kind of clicking together. And I'm a systems thinker, and so it just all made sense.
Okay.
It should all, of course, it's all related. And so that's kind of how we ended up. And then, basically, honestly, as a writer, my biggest personal challenge is being practical. I just love to nerd out on theology. This is like my favorite thing. And so to actually write something very practical and applicable and how to do this, that was a challenge for me. And so as I began writing this book, I thought to myself, I should make this as practical as possible. I should try and create a journey for people. And if you've heard my interview about how the book came about with my friend Anthony, I led this guy in a cemetery through an experience that I didn't know would work. It was nothing to do with the cemetery. It just happened to be. Yeah, we're not weird. Soaking, if you're into that. So we just happened to be in the rain in a cemetery, and he said, "Tell me what's going on in your life." And I said, "Hey, let's do this thing." And it's the thing that we'll do together in a minute. And he had a really amazing encounter with God. And I was like, cool, it works. So I wrote meditations for every day in the book and recorded the audio. And, people write to me now every day, and they're like, "Jonathan, this is like nothing we've ever read before, nothing we've ever done before." And I'm like, oh, good.
It's actually a thing. I did a thing and it works.
As surprised as anyone.
It's beautiful. Yeah, I heard someone say recently, and perhaps you heard it too, that the contemplative life is the charismatic life slowed down.
Oh, come on. So good.
That they're so much the same. And the more I experience the contemplative life, the more I realize this is the same thing, different, but the same. And incredibly healing and restoring to our minds, our bodies, our souls, the whole person.
I'm practicing contemplation, and I'm getting deeper into that, right? And then I'm reading someone's Instagram, and she's talking about self-compassionate mindfulness. And I'm like, The Venn diagram matchup on this is very, very close, right?
Yes. Yes.
So yeah, all these bits and pieces that we just start to reframe and integrate and draw in, that God in his wisdom has given to different communities and helped different groups understand different parts of it.
Yes.
But it's always better together.
Yes. Always better together. Well, I am super excited for you to lead us in this practice.
Alrighty.
So I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'm going to experience this along with everybody who's listening and watching now.
Okay. Well, thank you for this opportunity and invitation. It's just so special. So,
Absolutely.
All right. What I would like you to do is just get comfortable wherever it is that you're sitting or standing, just so that you're just kind of, so your body's kind of as neutral as it can be. Podcasting is really strange, right? Because we're so on and focused.
Yeah.
Even just for you, Susan.
Yes.
I think it's really important to know that God doesn't take us anywhere to leave us there. And that God, I mean, we have this scripture about us not being tempted beyond what we can bear. And I think it's what we've always interpreted in terms of sin. But God won't push you to confront traumatic memories or parts of your story that you aren't ready to process. And conversely, if you start to feel in your general life or in this moment the wiggly worm of something coming up from beneath, we can have hope that it's coming up because the Spirit says, now it's time.
Yes.
I'm here. You have grown. You are not who you were before. So we can work on this. So I just say all of that to just as a gift of peace to your hearts, that you know we're not going to do anything really scary or force you to drudge up trauma. That's not how healing works. But I know, unfortunately, many of us have had that experience. So if your shackles are up, I don't blame you, but I give you permission to return to peace. So I'm going to close my eyes, and you're all welcome to close your eyes. And if you'd like, you can put your hand on your heart. I like this as an ongoing practice because it grounds me in my body, and it's a touchstone that I can then come back to later. But you know what? Actually, I need this for me right now. I don't know if you need it for you. So let's just do something else just as we begin. I just want you to reach your hands all the way up and just kind of stretch your arms out, and then just kind of bring them slowly out, tracing like a big circle all the way around you. Some of these things, they just help us get back into our body. There's a beach ball breathing exercise that I sometimes do. You can basically just, if you breathe in and swing your arms all the way up, and breathe out and take them out on the outside. I teach this more thoroughly in the book, but just grounds us a little bit in the here and now of our bodies. And our bodies are really good. Your body is good. Your body was given to you by God, and it is uniquely purposed as a tent of meeting between you and the Lord. I know that our bodies experience some tough stuff, and we've been given a lot of narratives about our bodies. So sometimes it's important to just feel it and be present to it. Remember that Jesus has a body, that it was good and right for God to have a human body. It was good and right for God to be nourished by the placenta of a young girl for 9 months. It was good and right for God to be pushed out of a young girl's vagina. And it was good and right for God to nurse at a woman's breast. It was good and right for Jesus to poo and pee. So our bodies are good. Now, I would invite you to, in your imagination, picture Jesus, however it is that you like to connect. And if it's not Jesus to you, but just the divine or whatever, that's okay. Just whatever the fountain of selfless love is for you. For many of us, it's this guy named Jesus of Nazareth, who maybe looks to you like a Middle Eastern Jew, or maybe he looks like a lion, or maybe he looks like a lamb, or whatever that works for you. And I'd love you to just take a moment and look at Jesus, feel his company, feel his presence. And if it feels safe, think what it is about Jesus that you appreciate the most. And when you have a sense of what that is, tell him, Jesus, I just really love how I feel really seen in your presence, or whatever that is for you. Just go ahead and tell Jesus what you appreciate about him. And maybe he has something to say back to you, and that's fine. Just take a minute to be in that space with Jesus. Now, what I would like you to consider in your imagination is, can you picture what you looked like when you were a young kid, like 5, 6, 7 years old? If you're a visual person, this might be easier for you. Maybe there's a photo of yourself that is kind of become the archetype of what you think about in your own imagination of yourself. If you're maybe less visual, maybe it's something that you remember saying to someone when you were a child, or just picture however you can yourself as a young child. And when you have that picture, see if you can expand the picture a little bit so that that 5 or 6-year-old you comes over and sits on the lap of current you. So 5-year-old you comes to sit on the lap of 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70-year-old you, whoever you are. And now I would invite you to tune in to Jesus and ask him, Jesus, is there anything that I could say, that I need to say? Is there anything you want me to say to this younger version of myself? What do I need to hear myself say to myself? Jesus, what do you want me to say to this little one? And if you hear him say something to you, then I'd like you to do the really brave step of actually saying that then to the little one sitting on your lap. If that stirs up strong emotion, that's okay. If it stirs up no emotion, that's okay. You can take all the time you need. And when you come to a sense of peace, you can take a deep breath and open your eyes.
Thank you, Jonathan. It feels like holy space that I kind of don't want to run into and touch for people right now, but deeply meaningful. Thank you so much for leading us through that.
You're most welcome. We were touching just on this earlier. I think it was before we were recording. But never in my experience is Jesus unkind. Never in my experience does Jesus condemn, right? Jesus knows everything we've done and
Yes.
says, neither do I condemn you.
Yes.
It's wild.
Yes. It is wild. And that could open up a whole nother conversation. We might have to do this again because
That would be delightful.
yes, it would be. I would love that. But for today, thank you so much for sharing this time with us. Thank you for leading us in this practice. If people want to get more connected with you, reach out to you, follow you, what are the best ways for folks to do that?
You'll find me on all the social medias at Jonathan Puddle. I'm pretty active everywhere. Instagram is probably the best kind of relationship if you're on Instagram. And jonathanpuddle.com is where you'll find all my other writings, links to the book. You'll find the book on Amazon everywhere. You Are Enough, Learning to Love Yourself the Way God Loves You. And yes, there it is. And my podcast is there too, the Puddcast. It's on iTunes and Spotify and everywhere else. Would love to connect.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much. What a gift this time has been to me. And I know to everyone who shared it with us. Yeah. And if this has been meaningful to you, we'd love for you to like it, share it, do all the things to help other people find this. And we bless you today to live deeply rooted in the love of God for you. Thanks so much for joining us.